just tuning in, this is Shay sitting in for Nikki Beatty tonight. I'm just keeping the seat warm for her. Time now is 10:17. So if you would like to get in touch with the show and you would like to share your thoughts on any of the news stories of the day or from this week, then please do. I really want to talk to you tonight. It's been a while since I've sat in for Nikki, so would love to catch up with you. Give me a call, 020 722 42000. Tell me what your thoughts are on some of the stories of the day. You can also text as well if you'd like. It's 81333. Start the message with London. And if you're on email, it's yourlondon@bbc.co.uk. Now, for those of you who are on social media, I am too. It's at Sunny and Shay or at BBC London 949 on Twitter, and Sunny and Shay on the Facebook page, or BBC London 94.9 on the Facebook page. And I'll be able to, if you post your comments on there, I'll be able to read them out for you as well. Right now, though, delighted to say that I have in the studio Allan Miller, owner of the Vibe Bar. He's here with me now to talk about the paper review. It's lovely to see you again, Allan. It's been a while since we've last seen each other.
It has.
Now, Allan, tell me, how have you been? You've just come back. You've been away for a little while, haven't you?
Yes, well, I've been travelling quite a lot, actually, because we've, at the Vibe Bar, we sponsored the Battle of Ideas International Festival.
Right.
And the Battle of Ideas has a UK festival at the Barbican every year. It's now in its 10th year. So on the 19th and the 20th, it was in London at the Barbican Centre. 400 speakers, a few thousand attendees, really fantastic. Yeah.
What is the festival about?
Yeah, it basically is to engage the public in a debate and a discussion around a whole range of contemporary issues. Really, rather than lectures or seminars, it's much more about panels with different types of people, writers, artists, business people, academics and citizens, and the main emphasis is to really engage the audience to think about many of the sort of thorny, tricky issues, maybe not so much to come out with answers, but to begin a public discussion about how we may be able to think about things in slightly more provocative and ways that can begin to shed light on things.
Right.
Yeah.
And how was it received in Barbican then? Because as you say, it's 10 years in now, so I guess it's quite kind of well rooted and very well respected as a festival.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. With the first 7 years, actually, we're at the Royal College of Art, which is a fantastic venue, really lovely. But we kind of expanded, and this is the third year at the Barbican, and this year was really kind of a quantum leap. I thought it was a really significant shift in the right direction. It was a range of really interesting and sometimes tricky debates and discussions, everything from feminism to anti-Semitism after Gaza to the issues of growth and the economy and in America. So all sorts of really interesting discussions. The great thing is that because it goes on for 2 days, you kind of come out of one session and people carry on discussing in the breaks and into the next sessions. And there are also a lot of people internationally that come because we've now got this international satellite festival. So across Europe, in places everywhere from Amsterdam to Athens and Budapest, Zurich. I know I've just been in Porto a few days ago for a great panel on architecture, we're doing them in Stockholm and Malta and lots of countries, and also in the US and Nashville, New York. So, basically the idea is to expand that conversation internationally.
Fantastic.
And bring people, and then people come to the festival, but also have an ongoing sort of debate and discussion where more people can get involved in thinking about where we are.
So what's the website then, if anyone's listening thinking, oh, I like the idea of this?
Yeah, it's www.battleofideas.org.uk.
So battleofideas.org.uk. Now, I think you are suffering from what I've been suffering for the past week. Have you got a sore throat?
I have, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It's a culmination of a few things: the changing weather, the long hours that we have to do, and sort of all of that. So
And have you got any kind of tricks to how to recover it from? Because I have tried anything and everything from honey went through to medication. It's just lingering.
I definitely think hot water and honey's great, but aside from that,
there's not much you can do, right? It's just this weather, I think, as well. We had kind of freak weather last week where it was hot, and then now it's gone really, really cold. So it's playing havoc with us all. But look, let's get right to it, because I know you've got some fantastic stories in today to talk about. So what's the first story that you've brought in that you'd like to talk about then?
I think that the first one we should take a look at is the statistics that came out in the Independent, where it said European Union migrants add 20 billion to the British economy in just 10 years, in a decade, and that came out on Tuesday. And it was just basically discussing that a lot of highly skilled migrant workers come from across the European Union, and they boost Britain's finances significantly. And this analysis at the UCL also goes on to say that, you know, extra restrictions may limit the extra kind of revenue that's generated. Now, one could argue that things are not just about revenue that's generated. There's other considerations, but often I find the discussion about immigration, it can end up being quite parochial. It can be about the idea that we have fixed resources and people that are coming here are putting an unfair burden on a drain on them.
This must sound in some ways like good news then, no? Because actually it's saying the complete opposite to often what we do here. As you're rightly saying, you know, often you will hear anything to do with immigration sometimes can have very negative connotations attached to it, whether it's those people placing burdens. But this is basically saying the complete opposite to that.
Absolutely. And I think that, you know, what I have a view about immigration, and I think generally, like I think about population, actually, the more people that we have, the better. Now and the reason I think that is that because I think it's more people with more innovation, more creativity, more human potential. But that goes against the grain today, because we're often told that we have fixed resources and they're finite, and that more people coming in to take the cake will mean that there's less for people that are here. And that's a very static view. It doesn't take account of, you know, how we can sort of create new resources, create new technology that can resolve new problems, and also we can use our, you know, ingenuity. I think the interesting thing about this article is that it sort of gives some empirical evidence. To note, though, as well, that on the Wednesday, the Daily Telegraph came out with a leader saying that 120 billion cost of Labour's policy on immigration over the last 17 years. And they make the point that outside the European Union, they think there could have been more of a drain in certain areas, like the welfare and stuff like that. And I think that the thing is that when it just becomes about, and often people say, you know, you've got to have evidence, proof, justifications today and everything, and I think that's why the need to understand things a bit more complex and have a bit of a political or a moral discussion about the rights and wrongs of something is really important, because I think that just using one set of figures against another isn't really going to clinch an argument. I think you kind of have to shed a bit more light on it, but I thought it was interesting.
What are your thoughts on this? Because I was also looking at this story, and I, you know, like yourself, it's definitely something I came across, and I thought it was very interesting. What are your thoughts on this? It says immigrants who arrived since 2000 were 43% less likely than UK-born workers to receive state benefits or tax credits, and 7% less likely to live in social housing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the thing is that if we look at, you know, the last 100 years, on par, for the most part, immigrants that come to the UK provide an enormous contribution of physical and mental and creative contribution. And that's been of benefit to the whole of society. And I really think it's a very small-minded and disingenuous when it becomes about a discussion about just kind of almost being parasites or leeches on something. I think that, you know, America's a fantastic example of the idea that you bring people from around the world to create something better, the sum of its parts. You know, the whole is better than the sum of the parts. You create an idea and something that is consistently able to be dynamic and developing.
What would you say, though, to the perspective, and, you know, there are a lot of people, even some of whom will be listening to BBC London 94.9 right now, who would say, actually, we need to look at the other side of this coin, which is, it's fantastic. Yeah, it's great that immigration is bringing a positive side, but surely it is bringing a negative side, because those of us living here, working here, who for whatever reasons have to depend on some benefit because we're not getting the pay rises that we need, partly because, you know, particular immigrants will come here and perhaps work for less, or what, you know, there are some disparities when it comes to income. So what would you say to people like that?
I think the thing is that when we have a discussion about the state provision or resources, we should have a discussion about what we think society requires. And that I don't think should be differentiated. I think that if we think there's a provision or there's a social need, then we have a moral responsibility, we have a political duty to argue about what that is and how that should be distributed. And I think that as I say, I don't think that resources are fixed. I think that we've cut away a lot from the idea of the welfare state in the post-war period, and that's about a political decision, a series of decisions, and that's a discussion that we can have as a society, whether it be in health or employment or hospitals, wherever it may be. But the idea that people from abroad are just putting an undue strain on it is not really the right way to look at it. Okay,
I think you're right in the fact that we need to have a wider perspective and really look at all corners and all areas of this discussion when we talk about immigration. At the beginning of the show, I was talking about this story which is in the Telegraph, in which government is pushing to clean up Britain and make dropping litter as socially unacceptable as drink driving. And I've been asking, would you like to see littering become as socially unacceptable as drink driving? And on the line we have Trevor in Wembley. How are you doing, Trevor?
Yeah, hi Shay, thanks.
What are your thoughts then on littering? Do you think it's ever going to be socially unacceptable?
To me, it is unacceptable because where I live in Wembley, we have a serious problem with that. In that people, drive up, park up, and have their lunch or whatever, and then they just, rather than taking the litter away with them, they just drop it onto the pavement. And
really? So what?
Off.
All of the empty packets of lunch, sandwich packets, and everything?
Yeah, it tends to be like, stuff from McDonald's, like fast food wrappers or whatever, and Coke bottles and tin cans or whatever, along with like tons and tons of empty cigarette packets, and it's a serious problem around here. And it really, but I've written so many times, like, to counsellors and whatever. And,
have you?
Yeah, but they always just say, basically there's nothing they can do, and I suppose in a way it's true, because it's down to the individuals. Like, they know what they do. They know right from wrong. They know, like, as you and I do, that a bin is for litter. So you don't. So if you got litter, you drop it in the bin. Don't just drop it on the floor and then leave it there, knowing that leaving it for the bin, the dustman or whatever to collect it in the morning, because it's not right. And I think, although the government shouldn't have to do this like finding people, but it's at least they're showing.
Do you think the fining will work though, Trevor? Do you think the idea of knowing, that I could get fined, let's say, or someone listening could get fined if they've dropped a sandwich packet or, packet of crisps, whatever it may be, do you think that's really going to stop them?
I mean, I don't, obviously I don't know. I'd like to think it would.
Let me give you another perspective here. Christopher's texted in. I'd love to see your thoughts on this, Trevor.
Yeah.
Christopher says, Shay, why don't we introduce a money-back scheme on empty glasses, plastic bottles or cans, like they do in Canada and in Germany? Now, in Germany, supermarkets and every petrol station will have a machine that collects all of your empties. It then gives you a money voucher to spend within their store. This would clean up our streets. The scheme in Germany gives you 25 cents back on plastic, and it gives you 10 cents back on glass and cans. What are your thoughts on that then, Trevor?
Well, I mean, that's the first time I've heard of such a thing. I think, I would imagine people, if they knew that they could get, what was it, cash back or something?
Yeah, exactly. It's like almost like a little money voucher or actual cash back.
Yeah, if they knew that, I think that if they knew they were going to get something back, then they would probably think, well, rather than dropping it on the pavement, driving off, why not, take it back to the shop and get something free or whatever. But again, I don't think shops should really have to do that, because again, people know right from wrong, and I just think, we need a sort of like, I mean, I remember when I was a kid, there was that, Keep Britain Tidy campaign.
Yes, there was. I remember that.
Yeah, and it's like over the years, they're kind of gone, I know they still exist, but they don't really...
It's not as prevalent, is it? Alan, what are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on what Trevor's saying about littering?
Well, I think it's interesting, and also about, you know, the actual piece in the Telegraph, because it actually does indeed say that we support the view that littering should be as socially unacceptable as drink driving. Now, I think we take a step back for a second, and, you know, if you get into a car and you've been drinking, and obviously different people can take different levels of alcohol, but what you're then doing is you're putting yourself and other people in a position where you can kill them.
Their life's in danger, yours is in danger.
Yeah, exactly, or damage them or hurt them permanently or do all sorts of damage. Now, I don't think it's appropriate to make a comparison with that. I think that also I'm concerned with this constant drive to kind of control spaces and the obsession sometimes with rubbish as well. Like, on the one hand, there's this kind of increasing punitive regulation with things like everyone's rubbish, and you get fined for extra rubbish, and we're permanently sort of filtering out recycling stuff and different things, which doesn't have that much effect on anything except for our spare time. And at the same time, government who have very little ideas about how to generate growth or, you know, new infrastructure or social provision, then want to make a campaign around dropping litter.
What are your thoughts on what Allan has just said, Trevor?
Well, I mean, he's entitled to his opinion and everything, but I still think that, you know, the government shouldn't really have to fine anyone, because it's, you know, I mean, for example, when I was a kid, I would drop litter as well, because at the time I didn't think I was doing anything wrong, you know. But as I've grown up, you could say, I've become more aware of my duty, you know, because I like to think of, although I don't own much, you know, but I've got a duty to
within your community where you live.
Yeah,
I mean, we all like where we live to look nice, right?
Yeah, because when you think that way, it makes a positive difference.
Yes.
Like, you know, and I want to, you know, as I said, here in Wembley, unfortunately, we got a really serious problem with people that just don't care about.
Well, how do you think, though, if we were to really talk about this, how can the government kind of at least achieve this cultural change then towards dropping litter, in your opinion, Trevor?
I think another thing is that the way food is packaged. I mean, you know, I don't know. I mean, I'm no expert, but I don't know. But obviously, something has to be done.
Right.
You've got to do something.
You really feel like we're not, in a way, it does ruin the area, where you are. I mean, if you've got rubbish outside on your streets, then, you know, how are people living inside their own homes? What did you want to say, Allan?
Keynes, in his economic assessment, used to say things like, you know, you could always dig holes and fill them up again. He was making the point that you can create all sorts of jobs. Now, if it's the case that we have a problem with not enough jobs and we want to create growth and have a dynamic economy, perhaps we can have more people paid to go and collect rubbish and do all sorts of interesting things with rubbish. I don't think actually littering is a major significant issue. I think that how we handle our refuse and who we employ and who we pay to do them may well be, and there's no reason why we can't have a concerted effort around that. I just get a bit more concerned that you get these hyper-regulated zones, a bit more like Singapore and elsewhere, where it becomes obsessive about things like this, and it's increasingly about, it seems to me, about personal behaviour. And I just think that, you know, government can play a much bigger role in terms of large, ambitious infrastructure roles, which they're very averse to, rather than this behaviour modification.
Okay. Your final thoughts, Trevor, before you go?
That we should, people should just be more thoughtful, you know,
and vigilant.
Because it doesn't take that much effort. Just think. But, you know, when they go to McDonald's or wherever and they finish eating their food and they're just about to open the window and drop it, just think for a moment, you know, is this the right thing to do? You know, do they really have to drop it? Can't they just, you know, drive off and find a bin and then, you know, and dispose of it properly, rather than just dropping it on the pavement and, you know, and driving on? Because it's, you know, it
sounds like it's really distressing to you, Trevor.
Yeah, and just being more thoughtful, I think it will make such a you know, difference, and, you know, and it will make, you know, I'm getting all tongue-tied.
No, you're not. I understand what you're saying, Trevor. You think
it would
that
help the environment, you know, make the place sort of nice, and, you know, because
If you're walking down in the street, the last
Yeah,
thing is a whole load of rubbish on the floor.
I really don't like seeing it.
All right. Well, listen, thanks so much for your call, Trevor, and thanks for your thoughts. If you'd like to tell me your thoughts on littering and perhaps how we can make this kind of cultural change, then do 020 722 4200. Let's move on to the next story then, Alan, because I know you've brought in some really strong stories from the week this week, so I really would love to get the next story from you.
Yes, indeed. Well, let's do this one from The Times, which is asking whether the West can actually stomach making common cause with Tehran, with, Iran, to defeat a shared enemy. And it's by Michael Burley, who's an expert on terrorism. And he's posing a discussion that's been increasingly floated in a number of places, like the Wall Street Journal, the FT, and elsewhere, about to what extent Iran, as a regional player, can be used or can play a significant role in curbing or controlling ISIS. I think the interesting thing about this piece, and more broadly the discussion, is the absolute sort of disarray that currently exists in the West in terms of their sort of vernacular and their repertoire about geopolitics internationally. The very problem of that has led to this issue in the first place. The idea that, Western intervention thinks it can just destabilise a region, take away all the infrastructure and rule, kind of assume and hope for the best, and then it implodes, and everyone sort of completely doesn't know what to do. And then in addition to that, sort of isn't prepared to think sort of how it then resolves it in a sensible fashion. And you've got all these kind of contradictions, and some of it's quite tricky, obviously, because if on the one hand you demonise Assad and say that he's beyond the pale, and he may well be, and he's obviously done some very nasty things, how then do you then reconcile the fact that he may be the person that you need to work with in order to beat ISIS in that region? Or similarly, if one wants to discuss with Iran and Tehran about the role they play there, what does that mean for other partners in the area like Israel and Saudi Arabia and others who would be very concerned about Iran's role? I think the thing is that in this kind of post-Cold War order, we've got a really significant issue, which is that there's a kind of tendency often to intervene. It used to be around humanitarian intervention, then it was more about other things, but there's a tendency to something must be done. But then when the West finds itself in this situation, then doesn't know really what to do. So I think it's an interesting...
it is interesting. I guess what's a little bit different with the ISIS situation is the fact that also the Middle East themselves, for the first time, it has been very unprecedented, but the Middle East themselves have said, we require your help. That's not really happened before in such a unified way. So, the fact that we ourselves, in this country have been directly affected by losing some of our own public citizens to ISIS, kind of, in some ways, would you not say you can understand the perspective of many British people that we do need to do something?
Well, lots of terrible things have happened in quite a few areas. 200,000 people, dying in Syria and elsewhere. I think the thing about, ISIS and Al Qaeda and a lot of those organisations is that, ironically, the West has provided the context for them to expand and to be more popular in many ways. Had the response to 9/11 been one where in the States, George Bush and the rest of the Western world said this was a very tragic but lucky break for these guys. They are tiny, they're irrelevant, and we'll handle it, and we're going to get on with our life. That would have been a very different proposition than to sort of declare a war on terror.
Yes, but then isn't hindsight a fantastic thing?
Well, there were some people arguing that at the time as well. Because I think the thing is, like the idea of a war on drugs or the war on terror, you create the very beast that you say you want to eliminate. And we've become obsessed with terror. And I think that what's happened... Can you not...
Okay, yes, we've become obsessed with terror, but can you not see the other perspective, which is... it is slightly justified at the moment with what's happening with ISIS?
Well, I think the thing about ISIS is interesting is that on the one hand, the implosion and the deconstruction of that region has meant that the Sunnis that were left kind of on the outside of things ended up teaming together with a whole group of regional people, of which ISIS formed a component. ISIS is now presented, they've taken the general term of ISIS, but there's a lot of interest there that have been from the previous elite that got left out in the cold in the new set of relationships. I think my point about terror and terrorism is that when you have a situation where in Britain and elsewhere people are attracted to that, and where we have a situation where we become so obsessed that we're always talking about it, it ends up giving it a dynamic in and of itself that makes it more attractive, ironically.
Okay.
And I think that that's the other problem as well. It's almost like in Britain and in America, particularly in Britain, there's a very difficult discussion to say what's so good about Britain. When they've begun to talk about British values recently, people ran out of ideas quickly because it became apparent they didn't have a real vocabulary for it. And I think the thing is that the lack of an ability to be able to motivate what's great about us ends up reinforcing sort of that very problem.
Okay, so perhaps we need to look more within ourselves and what is great about our country.
Absolutely.
Okay, right, let's move on to the next story. What else have you brought in to talk about then?
The next one that we can discuss is the one that was in the Daily Mail and the Mail Online, which said this week that mothers who drink could be branded as criminals. It's a landmark court case of a pregnant teen who consumed half a bottle of vodka, apparently, and 8 cans of strong lager a day. Sounds, it sounds incredible and astronomical.
It does.
And obviously sounds very painful and unpleasant. I think the thing is about this, and the general idea that women can be treated as criminals for consuming alcohol, there's a couple of major problems I've got with this. On the one hand, I believe in the autonomy of a woman and to make decisions about her own body, and it shouldn't be down to the state or anyone else. That leads to a big discussion about what that means, and you could pursue it all the way down the line. But I stand by that. I have that moral view of that a woman should be in control of her body and no one else.
But, when you're talking about things like consuming alcohol, we already have guidelines. We have laws and regulations in place in this country. For example, earlier on we were talking about drink and driving. There is the other side that would say this is an extension of that. It's not about the autonomy of a woman. It is about alcohol consumption, full stop.
Right, and the people that are talking about alcohol consumption say all sorts of things, and we had the temperance movement in the past, and now alcohol's kind of been slightly demonised, like tobacco and other things today, where once again we have a big moral debate around people's personal behaviour, no big ideas about what to do in the world, kind of demonised behaviour.
You say that though, but we are dealing in this country with an epidemic, if you want to see it like that, with a binge drinking problem, especially under 25.
Let's come back to the binge drinking because it's very interesting. But just on this point, what ends up happening is like you'll see postings quite commonly now on social media and elsewhere. Where does it go? It's like, a couple of glasses of wine, one. What's appropriate for a woman? When does it become the case that woman is, so you use this terribly extreme...
a medically trained person would tell you that, surely. It's, is it not common sense, that a medically trained person will tell you, for example, how much medication you can take when you're pregnant, how much you can or cannot smoke when you're pregnant. No, because I think you're going to drink alcohol, surely your midwife or your GP, these are the people who should be telling you if they're not already.
Well... Yeah, everyone talks about units. These are the units you should have a week. What does that even mean? The thing is, who is to say it? Firstly, often we vary in size and we vary in tolerance and all that sort of thing. Secondly, these units, the unitification of life, as though somehow we as morally responsible, autonomous humans can't make decisions. Sometimes we may have a tad too much. Sometimes people may want to abstain and not have any.
But what happens then if you have a tad too much, but you are also a person who's responsible for a life growing inside you, which is like the case for this particular woman here?
Yeah, I think that women should be in control of their bodies and make decisions about that. And once one starts... saying that they can be treated as criminals for what they ingest or whatever, then it's a very big problem. It sets a new precedent.
But is that a wrong precedent is what I'm asking you?
Yes.
Because surely, I've gone through this article as well, and it's not something that is previously discussed about, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't discuss it. It talks about how alcohol harms unborn babies. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is not a new thing. It can affect a child from having disabilities and behavioural problems. So, there is a big debate going on at the moment that mothers, if you are pregnant, you have sole responsibility for that child. So should you not therefore be held accountable if you are going to be the person who is making some very, as quote unquote, even in this article, silly decisions like drinking half a bottle of vodka and 8 cans of lager a day whilst expecting to have a child?
Yeah, see, I think this is a very extreme case. Firstly, I mean, that would be an extreme case for someone who wasn't pregnant.
Yes.
I mean, half a bottle of vodka a day. I mean, you're not going to last that long if you're doing that. So obviously something else is going on, and there's a significant issue. But like many of these things, you have these really hugely, like, mad sort of examples that then get used to drive in certain precedents, and then they become generalised. Now, people might behave stupidly or in a silly fashion in your terms, but at the end of the day, when you start legalising all of those things, rather than saying, I tolerate it, I think it's reprehensible, I don't like it, I morally think it's disgusting, I wouldn't do it ever. But to then say that legally we're going to make precedents around it changes everything.
It does. But what I'm saying is, this discussion this week has been very much around about the fact that actually perhaps this is not talking about the social context here. We have laws, we have regulations in this country regarding alcohol consumption. The difference here is, it's never really been put into place for individuals who, therefore, okay, if you are, let's give you another example. If you get into a car, you are drunk, or you've had well above the legal limit, you are putting yourself in danger, but you're also putting those around you in danger. The same argument could be had for somebody who is pregnant and drinking alcohol, because they are essentially, what this disorder is saying, is putting that unborn child at risk, and therefore they should be held accountable. This is what the laws, the courts are talking about now.
You see, the thing is that we have laws about people, and I happen to think that the woman is the person, and until the baby is born, it's not a person. And however difficult people might find that, that's my view. And I think that the woman should have the autonomy, and there's a big issue once we start handing that
autonomy, though, to perhaps even harm that child.
Have autonomy over her own body, yeah.
Including the child. It's an interesting point. This is a debate that's being had right now, so it's interesting to see both sides of that.
Yeah.
But
and the point about the binge drinking thing, I think a couple of things. On the one hand, there's been a huge discussion that slightly overemphasises it, but I do think something's changed in Britain in the last 20 years, and that has been to do with our social fabric and how people go out and what they do. It used to be the case that children going into adolescence would be expected to join adult society, and often if people went to pubs and all of that, they would be expected to act as adults, and that meant acting like you were older, being responsible. If you had a few drinks, being sort of slightly strong and stoic and not showing that you were drunk. In an age where it's like, let everything hang out, and it's all about being young, and there's no sense of this notion that you have any kind of hierarchy or authority, all that censored out of meanings. Pubs no longer exist in the old way where you have different generations, intergenerational relationships. What happens is that you've got a bit of a culture where, where that kind of climate has arisen a bit more. So I think that's got to do with more with what we're doing in society and all of that, rather than just this idea of people being out of control per se.
Okay, well, I think that's a really interesting point. If you're tuning into BBC London 94.9 right now, and you're listening to the paper review with myself, Shay and Allan Miller, and you'd like to share some of your thoughts, then please do give me a call, 020 722 42000. That's 020 722 42000. Let's move on to the next story then, shall we, Allan? What else have you brought in to discuss tonight?
So there was a piece in The Sun by Mick Hume, who had a couple of really interesting sections on it, one on poppies in the Tower, but one on what's happened in Brick Lane. And obviously there's a story close to my heart because it's to do with what's happened in Brick Lane and also with the Vibe Bar. And it just talks about the fact that the Vibe Bar is now coming up to 20 years. There's obviously been a lot of changes in Brick Lane over that period. But what also it points to some of the changes in Tower Hamlets, where there was a kind of prevention of certain hours being used by late night bars and venues and nightclubs and that type of thing, and it quotes me actually saying that I thought that it was petty-minded, a war that was being waged in the nighttime economy. This is not just to do with Tower Hamlets, actually, or even just London. I mean, whilst it is happening in Camden and Southwark and Islington and elsewhere, it's happening in different cities up and down the country. And I think that one of the problems that we've got, and we see it a little bit in this new anti-social bill and policing and crime act as well, but there's a couple of things that are going on. On the one hand, whenever anything's discussed about the nighttime economy, the public are often discussed as though they're potential criminals or a potential nuisance. That's something fairly new. Often antisocial behaviour will be used as a term. We're going to do these things to prevent antisocial behaviour. There used to be crimes like assault or burglary or rape or whatever they were. Now there's this nebulous term. Tony Blair brought it in. It's been carried on by the coalition government. Antisocial behaviour doesn't really explain much, but it's used often to stop things, to restrict things. And then there's another thing that's going on, it seems to me, which is in politics and also in local councils and elsewhere. There's a tendency to regulate and restrict. So if an area becomes popular, like Brick Lane or Tower Hamlets, rather than saying, well, 99.9% of people are well-behaved, decent people that go out and have fun time, and that's great that we're getting all this more revenue and business rates and international coverage and there's a tiny minority that's like, you know, rotten eggs or bad apples, we used to call them. But that's where you need to concentrate crime. That's where you need to concentrate resources or restrictions on, not on nighttime economy or a kind of curfew that somehow you think, well, you do a blanket ban on things and that will just make the problem go away. So I think there's a couple of problems. The whole idea that the public is somehow a problem, that, you know, when it goes out, it needs to be curbed. And also the idea that how you do that is use business to do that. And sadly, I think it reflects one of the things that's happened with the state in the UK with a number of its institutions. It's now happening increasingly with the police, which is that closing police stations down, lack of resources. There's been an incumbency somewhat to privatise the role of the police. So nightclubs and bars and even some restaurants having increasing security personnel, CCTV. Or,
is this something that you found with Vibe Bar yourself?
Absolutely. But, you know, most venues now in London have a lot of pressure put on them to have ID scanners, for instance. We never voted in to have identification in the UK. It's interesting that everyone is quite compliant in the public. They hand over their driving licence and their passports. But that goes against the grain of the idea of a public that's slightly out of control. So, you know, but these things tend to happen, like private security firms now doing things in certain boroughs in London where policing was there and private policing got turned down. The police are accountable to a democratic process, whereas private organisations are not in the same fashion. And I just think it warrants some serious conversation. And I think particularly with the new anti-social bill policing act that came out about 10 days ago, you now begin to see they've got these things called public spaces protection orders. It's really weird because all these Orwellian terms, but public spaces protection orders. So now you can potentially use a public spaces protection orders to stop people wearing certain clothes, like in Blackpool where they go on stag nights, boys and girls, mini skirts or mankinis they call them. But once you start doing that, what do? You say, well, guys that are wearing jeans that are low cut, we'll ban them, or, you know.
How far is too far? You
know, and you're using... And then you've got other zones like Leicester and elsewhere where you say, well, there's no alcohol allowed to be carried around here, a bit like some of the regulations in the States. And then you have a discussion about smoking outside in parks and so on. And increasingly you see that there's this kind of legislation of public spaces protection orders can be used. So today, whether you're taking a photo somewhere or wanting to give out flyers, busking or rambling or even have a business, you realise that all of a sudden the public space isn't public anymore. And it's being regulated increasingly. And actually, there's more and more measures happening. But unlike the Criminal Justice Act of not that long ago, where there was quite a lot of uproar about it, it's kind of slipped under the radar a little bit. And I think that the nighttime economy and some of that stuff that's gone on with licence restrictions and the way policing has sort of controlled licensees are actually very, very scared to say anything in case they get attention because they can't afford to lose their licence. So I think...
How is it for you? Because obviously, you know, some of what you talk about is of course, a lot of it is from your own experience with Vibe Bar. But some of those regulations you talk about, you know, 20 years ago when they weren't here, when they weren't in place, there was a demand for them, and rightly so, perhaps at that time when things might have been difficult. But how is it for you now that you know after such a long period of time, it's such a iconic place, the Vibe Bar, for it to be closing down? How does that feel for you?
Well, I would probably want to come back on a couple of your points as well, but yeah, I mean, we've had a fantastic run. We came to Brick Lane and people said no one will ever go to Brick Lane for events or to go out. And we, you know, we're the co-founders. We brought all the original tenants to the Truman Brewery. Well, I brought people like Talvin Singh and, you know, Groove Rider and all these DJs and music producers and graphic designers and artists, and we built something and we developed something, we made something new, and it was a fantastic moment. And it's been used as an example of urban regeneration in many international institutions. It's obviously a destination attraction, and the Vibe Bar anchored all of that, and it's been a fantastic run, and we've showcased new talent, and it's been a really great journey.
It's a well-respected venue.
Yeah, I think
in
that,
Brick Lane.
Yeah, I think that but one always has to make decisions, like with a work of art or anything, about and what point does one want to continue doing things in the same way? And when I think it becomes untenable in some ways, either financially it becomes tricky because of some things, or also psychologically, then you've got to ask yourself a question: is it time to do some new things? It won't be the end of Vibe.
Okay, but, that's good. That's what I was leading towards. You know, there's a lot of people. I have seen the online campaigns. I've seen it on Facebook as well. Of, you know, is this the end? Or so what you're categorically saying here in BBC London? It's not the end of Vibe Bar. You know, there will be more in the future.
I'm saying we're having all sorts of conversations. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, that's good to hear.
And just the point about you know, because I think it's important that, you know, what you were saying, that there's some time ago, maybe some of the restrictions that happened, we should just remind ourselves that it was really from the First World War onwards, interestingly, because it's the anniversary now, that the regulation and licensing really got used a lot, and it was because it was to control the working class, to make them fit for war and not let them drink too much. And every time we've had a regulation, it sort of consolidated an idea about, you know, what ordinary people should do. Interestingly, not in private members clubs or anything like that, because they're okay to sort of do that sort of thing.
So you feel like it's more kind of controlling the common people than the richer folk, is that what you're saying?
Well, it's absolutely always been about that.
Okay.
But I think that the thing is that there was a discussion about 24-hour licensing and loosening things up around 2003. Interestingly, what's happened has been the reversal of that.
Why do you think that never really kind of picked up?
A few reasons. It was floated as an idea, and then, you know, what happens is that previously different people were in decision making in the area, and what happened was some of the responsibility got passed over. But I think that we've had a risk averse, precautionary attitude in the recent period towards the nighttime economy. I think that it's, you know, policing and other things are seen always in terms of what's the problem rather than what's the solution. Crime figures are talked about a lot, but, you know, serious crime in London and the UK has gone down. Things like phones being lost, mobile phones has gone up a bit. So you have those kind of things going on, and you say, it's that weird conversation because, you know, we're trying to stop antisocial behaviour in crime, and then we say, well, what are those things? And you realise that some of those actual things are going down. This is a very particular thing, but that's used as a discussion to kind of monitor and control certain areas. So, yeah, I think sometimes you have to get underneath it a bit more
and understand what it all really means. Right, earlier on, Allan and I were talking about a mother-to-be whose drink could brand her a criminal. It's a landmark court case of pregnant teen who consumed half a bottle of vodka and 8 cans of strong lager a day. And John in Feltham has called in. How are you doing, John?
Good evening, Shay and Alan. Yes.
What are your thoughts on this?
It's about control by the government. I think they know they will have big problems in the future, so they're trying to encourage with laws now. Because in the past, it would be just about a woman who drinks too much when they're pregnant, we're going to arrest you and take away your kid. But today, I believe we are getting 1% laws to control us. So, for example, if 1% of women do drink too much, now the government is saying, well, because that 1% do drink too much when they're pregnant, we're going to stop the other 99% from drinking. Because if you're found drinking, even if it's only one glass of wine a month, but you happen to be spotted when you're drinking that glass of wine, you're going to be arrested and you're going to get a big fine or go to jail.
Well, it's not as kind of straightforward as that, though, just yet, is it, John? Because what they're really looking at is kind of, you know, the detrimental effects that it will have on the child. So, for example, for this particular 17-year-old, this teen, the girl who is now 6 was born with fetal alcohol syndrome and suffered growth retardation as a result of her mother's drinking. So it's not just going to be, okay, we see a woman drinking, perhaps one glass of red, and then she's going to get arrested straight away. I mean, it's not going to be as straightforward as that. There'd be a longer procedure and obviously looking into has it had a direct effect on the child.
Well, you say that, but if you're an intelligent parent and you got one day off a month from work and you drove your kid to school and it took 5 minutes to get there, and you knew that if you smoked a cigarette and it wouldn't hurt him because it was only 5 minutes per month that he's in a car with smoke, given the London pollution, you can't do that anymore, even though you're intelligent, because the government says you're stupid if you smoke in a car and with a kid, and if we catch you, we're going to arrest you.
But then, you know, look, there's the other side to that coin, isn't it? How would a police officer know that's a one-off once in a month or something that you do smoking regularly in a car, which is very detrimental? Alan, what are your thoughts to what John is saying?
I think there's a couple of things. I sympathise a lot with what John's saying, actually, because you may say that it's not going to be about one or two glasses, but I think that we've seen that with all of these discussions, things get floated and it goes in a certain direction. And in the past, if you look at novels or anything like that, you see these tragedies. On the one hand, a lot of women used to die in childbirth in the West. Some still do in the rest of the developing world. In the West, they don't as much. The other thing that happens, there would be these tragedies where some people drank themselves to death, or some people took drugs or whatever, and that would have a detrimental impact on them, or they're or being pregnant, they'd lose it and miscarry or whatever. It's a moral discussion. You can say it's reprehensible, it's terribly sad, or it's horrible. When you legislate against it, that becomes a whole new discussion about the state and women's independence and autonomy. What would you like
to say to that, John?
Well, I would agree with that, because, as I say, there's so many laws now that I would call 1% laws. You know, the bedroom tax came in because the government said, well, look at all the people now who have extra rooms, and it started out with those families who have eight kids, you know, and getting, you know, £50,000 a year in benefits, and therefore, you know, that was 1% law. And we keep on getting 1% laws all the time to change our society, like that one about single men and single women going to parks. That's going to change our society, because all of a sudden you're going to be looked at strangely by everybody in that park who have got kids, if you're a man or a woman, and that changes society. And so it does as well with anything else where the 1% laws come in. And
so you're talking, let me just kind of elaborate on that. You're talking about the story whereby if you are, a man has been banned from entering a particular park on his own because of paedophile fears, and what they're saying is if any adult walks in this particular park, whether it's a male or a female alone, they could well be arrested. Look, thank you so much for your thoughts.
Can I say one more thing quickly?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, you're going to be talking about obesity for kids.
We are, yes.
Well, why are kids obese? Because the parents don't let their kids out on the street or to go down to the park. Why? Because they're paranoid about paedophiles. And
so you feel it's an ongoing
circle. It's connected with this story about men and women going to the park.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, it's an interesting point. We are going to continue talking about that. Thank you so much for your call, John.
Okay. Have a good evening.
You too as well. Thank you so much. Joining us on the line right now, we have Burchak in Dulwich. How are you doing, Burchak?
Hello, Shay. I'm the first-time caller to your show.
Oh, well, welcome to the show.
So great. It just made my hands, and Shay and Allan. Now, the ISIS topic.
Right, go ahead. What are your thoughts?
Now, when you go into these countries like Iraq, what happened with Iraq, now they want to go into Syria, you obviously, how do you say, annoy, when you bomb all these countries now, you get a bigger terror threat, you get a bigger fundamentalist, yeah? Now what they did was they've created total anarchy in that country, and obviously these terror groups are coming back now, more stronger and more stronger. Now these people have created a bigger monster, which now wants to hate against the West. And what will happen is, obviously, a lot of things will happen.
What do you think then, Burchak? Do you think that really the West needs to just stay out of it? Is that what you're saying?
Now, obviously, what I'm saying, I don't want to get myself in trouble, but I want to say that the West need America and Britain. I mean, they need America, especially. They need to chill it down, because what they're doing is they went to Libya, they went to Iraq. So now all these things, they're making the region, the things out of control. And what's going to happen is it's going to backfire. You know how you shoot a boomerang and it backfires? Now, they're inured, which means getting used to go into these countries, and their soldiers are getting inured to losing their lives. And then they come back, either their legs go, and a lot of things are happening, and ISIS are getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
But what would you say, Burchak, to people who are saying, we have had British citizens murdered, absolutely horrifically murdered by ISIS, and therefore it is our country's duty, absolute duty, to respond to that?
Well, in the first place, what were they, if they were British citizens or British soldiers, whoever, if they were soldiers, then what they were doing there in Syria? Now they were saying Assad is a bad terror. Now they turned on ISIS now. You see what I mean? How they backfired and
Let me just bring in Allan on this. Allan, what are your thoughts?
Well, the thing is that it's obviously terrible when any citizen's killed by someone that this happens to. But one has to ask the question, what use is intervention? I believe in a really old-fashioned concept, which is national self-determination, people making decisions about their own nation states.
Okay.
Now, the West went in and tore apart Iraq, which actually had a really strong infrastructure, had provision for, you could say you didn't like Saddam Hussein. There were lots of people
there are lots of people who say they went in also because of the fact that, there was so many atrocities and human rights atrocities occurring during that period of time.
But they weren't going into China, and they weren't going into, there was all sorts of places where things happen, right? And they were actually an ally of Saddam Hussein for a long, long time. It was only when it suited a very particular purpose at a very particular historical juncture that they made a decision. As it happens, April Glasby, the American representative, told Saddam Hussein that the Americans had no position on his relationship with Kuwait at the time. They suddenly changed gear because American geopolitical interests decided it needed to cohere a new sense of kind of moral purpose around not having a Cold War anymore, and it used Iraq in the first war to do that, and in the second one really kind of finished that whole discussion. Now, the thing is, but the other problem is that even when they went in, you've got this geopolitics that has no orientation, so it's unhinged, so it hasn't got a strategy. So you think shock and awe will go in, it all be great, they'll all love us, as though somehow you're at the end of World War II and people are giving you garlands. It's ridiculous. You think, what's going to happen if you take apart the whole way that society's been governed, the nuances of different regions, how tribes work together with the state apparatus, and you just bomb a bit and dispense with the rest and leave a vacuum? I mean, what does anyone think is going to happen? It's going to be a disaster. And we are living, and then to say that more intervention is going to somehow make it better.
So you think more intervention is the wrong way to go?
I think intervention in the first place is what caused this.
Okay.
And then having more intervention is just going to exacerbate the problems. However, there is now an objective issue, and it has to get handled and dealt with. But I think we have to understand that intervening creates these problems. And when we want to look at who's responsible, I don't look at ISIS or some of the Sunni groups there. I look at Britain and America and all the West that intervened and disrupted that region.
Okay. But Burchak, I know you also wanted to talk about pregnant women and drinking. What were your kind of thoughts on that, Burchak?
Fantastic thoughts from Allan. And the pregnant woman and drinking. Now, if she drinks or smokes or whatever, and that child comes out badly, and which I think it has, hasn't it? The child come out badly.
Yes. She was affected, yes.
Yes. Maybe I believe that they have a right to maybe arrest her, but before this problem happens, the parents need some training. Now, I work at Speaking Up Southwark, and just like we're trying to train the police, they need to be training of the parents.
Right, so you mean like one-on-one with, whether that's a midwife or perhaps it's particular classes, perhaps, is that what you mean?
Yes, to train them before this arrest, because, as you know, there's cuts of doctors, cut off the police, as this man mentioned, Allan has mentioned, and if they do not train, there needs to be places and clinics that would train, the state needs to train these parents, get it into their mind that drinking with a baby, when a baby's been born, could do that, and they should do that, because if you put out these harder laws saying arresting and this and that, and God knows what's going to happen next. They're going to do it anyway. So as
opposed to passing another law, or as opposed to holding, some of these women accountable for the kind of what happens to their children once they're born from the results of drinking alcohol whilst they're pregnant. What you're saying is actually we need to look more at the prevention, look at the beginning stages. So even before a woman is pregnant, is to talk to them about the detriments of alcohol whilst you're drinking alcohol whilst you're pregnant.
Yes, exactly. There's many topics to talk about. I would love to talk more.
Well, listen, thank you so much for your call, Burchak, and don't be a stranger to the show. You have yourself a lovely Sunday evening. Thank you so much for your call. Take care.
Bye.
Now, Allan, time is against us. We have run out of time. Thank you so much for coming in, and thank you so much for your stories. I had a lovely tweet from Mark, which I wanted to read to you. Mark says, "Good evening, Shay. During the summer months, I paid a visit to Brick Lane and Whitechapel area, and I saw the Vibe Bar. It's a very, very good place." So we wanted to say that out to you. Thank you so much for coming in and spending your Sunday evening with me, Allan. If anyone would like to follow you, are you on Twitter?
I am. It's at Allan Vibe.
At Allan Vibe. Very simple. ALANVIBE. Thank you so much for coming in, Allan. Hopefully we'll catch up soon.
Great. Thanks, Shay.